welcome everyone. This is third virtual and 17th overall Newburyport Literary Festival. My name is Leslie Hendrickson. I'm on the steering committee. And on our panel, we have Jenna Blum, who is the New York Times and internationally best-selling author of novels Those Who Save Us, The Storm Chasers, and The Lost Family, the novella The Lucky One in the collection Grand Central, and the memoir Woodrow on the Bench, about her senior Black lab and what his last 7 months taught her. Jenna is one of Oprah's top 30 women writers, with her work published in over 20 countries, and is the co-founder and CEO of literary social media marketing company A Mighty Blaze. We are currently live streaming to A Mighty Blaze's Facebook, and Jenna really was instrumental in getting the first virtual Newburyport Literary Festival going. So we are a huge fan of Jenna, as we are of everyone who's involved. Meredith Hall's memoir, Without a Map, became a New York Times bestseller. It was named the best book of the year by Kirkus and Booksense, as well as Elle's Reader's Pick of the Year. Ms. Hall was a recipient of a 2004 Gift of Freedom Award from A Room of Her Own Foundation. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Paris Review, 5 Points, the Gettysburg Review, Kenyon Review, Southern Review, and many other journals. She divides her time between Maine and California. Stephen Rowley is the best-selling author of Lily and the Octopus, a Washington Post notable book of 2016, and the editor named by NPR and Esquire magazine as one of the best books of 2019. His new novel, The Guncle, was hailed by O Magazine as one of the LGBT books changing the literary landscape, and it was a Goodreads Choice Awards finalist for Novel of the Year. And our moderator, Hannah Harlow, has an MFA in fiction from the Bennington Writing Seminars. After working and publishing for 17 years, she most recently at Houghton Mifflin Harcourt as executive director of marketing. She left in January 2020 to purchase the bookshop at Beverly Farms in Beverly, Massachusetts. She lives on the North Shore of Massachusetts with her husband and 2 boys. Hannah, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you to all our panelists for being here. And most of all, thank you everyone at home for being here. It's a beautiful Sunday afternoon. And I'm just so excited. I hope you've all had a wonderful weekend of events. So today we are talking about grief, which sounds so sad, but we're gonna have a good time. Books about grief come in many shapes and sizes. Books in which grief is a topic are incredibly varied too. So that's why I'm so excited to have these 3 authors with us. They've all written very different types of books. And so I think it's gonna be a really rich conversation. For everyone at home, I encourage you to use the chat to tell us the most recent novel or memoir that you read, and tell us if there was a character grieving or mourning something in it. I want to take sort of an informal poll, because I think this topic is more prevalent than maybe we've all realized. And at the very least, we'll have a great reading list at the end of the hour. So to get us started, I'd love for each of our authors to tell us about your most recent book and the role that grief plays in it. Just let's get everybody grounded in what your novels are about and memoirs. So Jenna, why don't you get us started?
So just gonna reach to my shelf here. This is my latest book, is Woodrow on the Bench. It was my first memoir, which I always have to say like a memoir because I never intended to write a memoir, and I still feel there is something a little bit Zsa Zsa Gabor about writing about oneself. And the memoir, although it is ostensibly about my beloved Black Lab Woodrow, who lived to be 15, and the last 7 months of his life when he was not mobile. So every day I carried him literally in his harness from my apartment in downtown Boston to the bench across the street, which was as far as we could get. And he held court there while our neighbors and friends and strangers knit themselves around us in this impromptu community. And so the book is very much about pre-grieving, I think, and about understanding that we were heading toward this cliff because Woodrow did not have that long to live, and then what it was like to go over the cliff and how this new community helped me get through that process. But it also became a book about me and about grieving, and one of the notes that the memoir hits, as sort of a backstory note, is that the year before, like right before actually Woodrow got diagnosed with congestive heart failure, I lost my mom to breast cancer. So the premise of the book is that I could not be, I felt, the person who had those two tremendous losses in the same week. And so the rather slender volume explored what it was like to deal with that big grief and feel sort of stunned, and then have the grief about my beloved dog, who was my mainstay, help me through that bigger grief.
Thank you. And Stephen, how about you?
Yeah, I actually have two novels that really touch on grief. My debut, Lily and the Octopus, like Jenna, is about my dog, Lily, although this is in novelized form because I didn't have the courage to write a memoir. And also I threw in an octopus for some reason, which might seem a little strange, but I knew inherently what I was writing about in terms of grief was attachment and how difficult it can be to let go, and somehow having a, tentacular metaphor for my grief. That made sense to me. It's a little bit odd perhaps, but I'm so grateful that that book has been so embraced by readers. And then just out in paperback was my novel from last year, The Guncle, which is, I intended to write a very comedic novel, a sort of modern day take on Auntie Mame. But early on in the writing process, which is what often happens because it takes so long to write a novel at times, is I lost my best friend from college to breast cancer, and she left behind a 6-year-old son. So the story that I was writing about an uncle, hibernating in the Palm Springs desert, who's suddenly unprepared to take in his niece and nephew after the death of their mother, was a much more serious exploration of grief than perhaps I had originally intended. It's still hopefully very funny, but I think coupling the humor with a serious exploration of grief is what allowed me to have these characters have a season of healing sort of for all three of them. So that's The Guncle is the most recent book.
Thank you. And I promise you it's very funny. Meredith, what about you?
I've told Stephen I admire writing funny so much. I am completely unable to write funny, and I admire it. So I first wrote my memoir, Without a Map, about an event that took place. The story starts when I was 16 in a small town in New Hampshire, and I got pregnant, and this was in 1965, and the repercussions of that pregnancy were very harsh. My family expelled me from home and family, and the baby was taken away and disappeared into the world. And it is a story of certainly loss and sorrow, and it's a kind of unnamed loss because this was a secret event. I was not allowed to speak to anybody about it, and that rule of silence and of secrecy for several decades finally led to me saying that I was going to break that silence and tell this story. And I was surprised by then. I had lived with this loss for a long time. I had met this child in the meantime, and he had become part of my family. And so it becomes really a movement from tremendous loss, really traumatic loss for a 16-year-old girl, through to finding a kind of grace, a kind of acceptance of these events, and an understanding that I was in fact a loved child, even though a lot went wrong. And last year, my first novel, Beneficence, came out, and this is, I was surprised to discover, also a book in which there's a lot of loss and sorrow surrounding a child. And this is a story about a farm family. They live in Maine. This is a very successful farm and a very successful family. And there are 3 children. The parents, Doris and Tup, love each other very much. And everything seems to be safe on this farm. It's very rural, and everything seems to be safe. It starts in the late 40s, after the war, when the world was hopeful. But a tragedy hits. They lose a child in this story very, very violently, very traumatically. And so we watch this family as they go through that grief and then struggle to find their way back to each other and to the calm that they had known.
That's so great. Thank you. And so interesting to see how your first book informs your second book, Meredith. When you talk
Yes,
about
I
grace, you can
hadn't-
just see that suffused through your novel.
I hadn't honestly understood that at all as I wrote my novel. It was only when I started doing public events and readers said, boy, I see some similarities between your memoir and this novel. And I think it was a very good thing. I had no idea that I was brushing against my own events at all. I was completely oblivious. And I think that actually helped the writing a lot.
Isn't that fascinating that sometimes it's readers who help you understand your own writing, and that is what is so
Absolutely.
rewarding about the relationship between reader and writer, I think.
That's
And
so
then you
cool.
go back and say, how did I ever miss that?
Yeah.
You know?
I pretended I was, oh yeah, that was my intent all along. Yes, of course.
So a cool thing that happened to me after I read each of your books and I was thinking about this panel is I realized that the significant deaths in each of your books happened at different points. So for Stephen, it was right in the beginning. For Meredith, it was sort of in the middle of the book. And for Jenna, it was at the end. So I have kind of a question for each of you about that. So Stephen, I want to start with you. So your main character kind of, the death of his sister-in-law is sort of the inciting event that gets your novel going. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your writing process. I mean, you kind of started to talk about how the idea came to you, but if you could talk maybe a little bit more about that, how you drafted your book and how that sister-in-law's death was significant in your plotting.
Yeah, that was always going to be the inciting incident, even before that I lost my actual friend, which sort of changed the way and the tone of which I was writing a little bit. I always saw that as the inciting incident. However, as I say, it does take a long time to write a book. So life doesn't stop while you're writing, and it can intercede. But I had originally planned a straight out, I think my most comedic book to date. I was long inspired by Auntie Mame, the Patrick Dennis novel from the mid 50s. And then, that had a whole history as a Broadway play and a movie with Rosalind Russell, and then a Broadway musical with Angela Lansbury and a movie musical with Lucille Ball. And so, I thought it was time for an update, but Mame sort of shipped her nephew, her ward, off to boarding school, and it really sidestepped the issue of grief. And as soon as I lost my friend, I was thinking about grief in children, particularly in a much more serious way. And I felt that I had a responsibility not to sidestep what the loss that these children had experienced. So, it definitely changed, I think, the tone. But I think, humor and grief, tragedy and comedy are two sides of the same coin. I'm far from the first person to discover that. Humor, I think, just plays such a huge role in what we were, in how we process grief, because grief isn't a temporary thing like a cold or a flu that we can get over in a way. We have to learn to live with that, and it becomes such a part of the fabric of who we are. And humor becomes such an important, I think, defense mechanism sometimes, or just a way through. And I think it becomes, I don't know how Jenna and Meredith feel, but like for me, like the hardest part of my work, or I think sometimes the most important part of my work, is balancing that, because sometimes you tell one joke too many, and it can really throw off the tone of an entire scene or chapter or the book itself. But conversely, if you go too long without giving your reader the opportunity to take a breath, with a laugh, that the book can conversely be too sad, too heavy, too dark. And so finding that balance in writing is something I did. Now, I say, as I always intended this to be the case, but I think, once I had lost my friend, that she really informed the character of Sarah, the sister-in-law, or the mother of these children have lost. And so that I think allowed me to sort of anchor the book in some very real world a place where I was working through my own grief as well. And so that was a very, very interesting in the process, the writing process, because I didn't think of like, I was writing this story for fun, at first, and it became a way for me to process grief and about losing a friend, losing a parent, and some of these issues.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask this later, but since you brought up the humor aspect, I think, even when I was telling people what this panel was about, everyone was like, that sounds so sad. So these books that you've written could be so incredibly depressing, and yet they're not. And so, Stephen, you've obviously used humor to kind of balance the novel and make sure it doesn't go too far in any one direction. And Jenna, I feel like you did that too with your book. And Meredith, I felt like you used well, we talked about grace before and sort of the beauty of the land. And so I wonder, Stephen, you said you were cognizant of that. Like, are there other tools at your disposal? How cognizant are you as writers as you're talking about that? So Jenna, maybe you can comment on that too.
Sure, I would love to. Thank you. And Stephen, I would love to know what your friend's name was so I can think about her when she inspired me.
Yeah, her name was Stephanie, and she has been gone, oh God, almost 4 years now. And think about her every day still.
Right? Isn't that an amazing thing? Every once in a while I think, well, my dad's been gone since 99, which is like so long. And yet I think about him every day in a very, like it gets easier over time, but you never really let go of that. So the tools that I use, and I'm glad we're talking about humor, and I love the idea of grace also as a mitigating force, not just for grief in fiction or nonfiction, but also in life, like looking for humor, looking for grace, knowing that those are constant states, even as grief moves like a big storm cloud across your emotional landscape. When I was writing Woodrow, I was very lucky in a sense because it was a memoir, and the humor is baked in because I was writing about a dog. And even though the last 7 months of his life were really challenging because he weighed only 10 pounds less than I did. And I was carrying this big dog around, and I was doing a lot of physical caretaking. And a lot of what the book became about was the fact that I was doing it on my own. I'm not married at the moment and don't have children to tell me how uncool I am, but also not to help me with my big dog. So I really was reliant on the kindness of friends and strangers and neighbors, which was its own sort of grace. But there also were these moments of humor because Woodrow was always funny in the way that Black Labs are always funny. And Woodrow in particular was funny in this way that of how he used to throw shade at me. And project his voice into my head. And those of you who have dogs, you know what I'm talking about. Like, don't look at me like I'm crazy. You know what I'm talking about. Woodrow sounded, as I told his audiobook narrator, like a combination of George Clooney and Barack Obama. So basically the perfect man. And that was the voice I heard in my head every day, so that I would wake up and I would hear Woodrow's voice from under my sleeping loft. And he'd be saying, look, Mamu, something is very wrong. The dog is starving. The dog has become emaciated overnight and needs to be fed. And the whole book is like that. There's a dialogue between me and Woodrow that is the running dialogue he sustained his whole life. So I think that helps. And I was also very cognizant that not only did I need to honor him, but also not make my audience, totally break down as like a torture device writing about my old dog. So for every scene in which I had Woodrow being old or sick, I included a companion memory of him being young. And as my agent says, my beautiful French agent said, he was such a baller, Jenna, like he was the big baller. And so I tried to include a big baller memory for Woodrow or a silly puppy memory so that the reader wouldn't feel just, eviscerated. And I think that is a big part of grief and of life, looking for those lighter moments and that state of grace.
Yeah, I love that. Meredith, how about you? How did you go about thinking about, there's a death of a child in your book. It's like so heartbreaking. I cried a lot, but in a great way. But how did you feel like you balanced that sadness?
Well, I knew as I started this book that the only thing I knew about this book was that I wanted to look at this man at top. I knew that something terrible was going to happen. I imagined that it was going to be the death of this child. I had heard a small bit of a conversation about something that had happened in my town years before. And it caught my attention. And really my focus as I thought about this book was on this man and what I imagined were going to be selfish and self-protective, self-concerned decisions that he was going to make that were going to be costly to the people around him. So that was all I knew going in. And as I I knew that I needed to set up this family before we got going and before we got to that moment. And so I write really a kind of everyday life in this family. It goes on for most of a year through seasons. And the book is told in 3 voices. So Doris, the wife, Dodie, the daughter, the middle of the 3 children, and Tup each have a voice in cycles in this book. And Doris introduced this. When I sat down to write, I knew nothing. I had no plan whatsoever. And a woman named Doris came to the page and started talking. And what she talked about was her husband, Tup, and her profound love and respect for him and the joy that they found in each other. And it really shifted everything for me. I suddenly understood that this is essentially a love story, love between parents and love between parents, love between a husband and wife, and love between parents and their children. And also the phenomenon of this farm. It's a very, very beautiful place. The work is very demanding, but it's very satisfying. It's a highly productive farm on truly beautiful land. And that's a world that's important to me. The beauty that we're surrounded with is something that sustains me. And I found that it was sustaining my characters too. But here is this guy that I thought was going to be my bad guy. And in fact, even before this child dies, he proves himself not to be the bad guy at all. And that shifted the story. And now the focus is not on the misbehavior of a guy in a family doing added harm. And he may, in fact, have done some of that. But the focus is on actually the celebration of the life that this family has known. And I am a storyteller. I am an episodic storyteller. So my memoir is too, actually, and this novel are told in a series on over and over and over again, these small stories from memory or something that happened this morning or something that one of them said last night. And so those stories, I think, work to build a kind of foundation underneath that grief. And it also is a foundation of a joyful family's experience in this place, and the grief intrudes on that. And so I think that storytelling is what carries, allows us to tolerate that degree of grief, which knocks them over. It knocks them over for sure.
Yeah. So I'm going to keep you talking for 1 second, Meredith, because going back to so your death happens kind of in the middle of the book. And it's not a spoiler, like, you know this going into it. And so I felt like reading the first section of your book was this incredibly intense experience, because you don't know something bad's going to happen to somebody, you don't know who it is. And almost every sentence I was reading these like double meanings and this like foreshadowing. So I have to ask, and actually I read this with our store's book club, and they would be really disappointed in me if I didn't ask, what order, or like, how did you write the book? Did you go back to that first section last and infuse that meaning? Did it all come out straight through? Like, I'm so curious.
Yeah. I am a new writer. Writing a memoir was 10 years ago, and it was a different experience. I had taught writing in an MFA program for many years and decided to sit down and write memoir myself. It was a different experience. The stories exist in place and time, and I recorded them. When I sat down to write this novel, I thought, I read a lot. How hard can this be? I'm a storyteller. I know how to do this. I'm a narrative writer. And I realized I knew nothing. I made very naive decisions about 3 narrators, which I think can be very challenging. And I didn't understand that I was taking on that large challenge. It covers the time from the late 40s to the mid 60s, and that presents its own challenges. I made the decision to write in first person, present tense, but because of all of the storytelling they're doing, we slide back into past tense constantly. And I didn't understand the challenges that I was creating for myself as I did this. I sat down and thought, I'm just going to write the story. I write very privately. I don't share my writing with anybody at all until the book is done. And so I sat down on page 1, and Doris started talking, and I concluded the book a year and a half later. And a wonderful editor, Josh Bodwell at Godine Publishing, had heard me give a reading from it and asked to look at it and bought it. So he received it as I wrote it. I expected to do rewrites, but he didn't ask for any. So you're reading what went onto the page,
Wow.
which is profoundly,
That's amazing.
profoundly isolated and private process.
I just want to jump in and say, if novelists knew the challenges we were in for from the outset, we would never write. No one would ever write a book anyway. So some of that naivete is what makes art happen.
Yeah,
well,
you know,
yeah.
Stephen, a friend of mine, a writer, writing colleague at the university, said, you're writing in first person. You need to write third person, omniscient narrator. It will be so much easier for you. So I sat down and tried to imagine, how do I write third person, omniscient narrator? I didn't have a clue in the world. I simply had to go to a natural voice and just assume it was going to work. Yeah.
Jenna, in your memoir, you talk about that there's a point in your book where you have friends coming and you're all writing together. I mean, like next to each other, essentially. How much input do you get from other people as you go, or not?
Not much, actually. I have a group of readers who I rely on and love and trust, but mostly it's verbalizing what I'm doing and telling them about it and talking through those issues. And I've come to realize more and more over the years how helpful it is, because when I'm talking about my book to other people, I think, oh, I know more than I thought I did. So, because I have like terrible doubt at the beginning of every project. I despise, I'm a person who writes to connect with an audience. So this is my favorite part. And I despise sitting down to make a big mess, you know? So I actually, Meredith, I'm so awed and impressed by your story. I'm never telling my novel workshop that story, because they'll think they don't need to be edited and they can just write something in a sort of like orgiastic isolation bliss and give it to an editor who will never request anything. And that never happens. You are like a unicorn. I'm so amazed by you. But I do actually need editing. And what happens is I try to finish a draft before I hand it to anybody. And then I give it to my fabulous agent, who also has an MFA and did it on Isaac Bashevis Singer, and comes at my book with this very literary sensibility. And we kick it around for a while, and then we give it to my editor, HarperCollins, Sarah Nelson, who comes back with sort of mid-level edits saying like, this scene doesn't make sense. I don't really know how to fix it. You're the writer, you fix it. And then it goes through several more iterations of copy edit and proofreading. So what happened with Woodrow is I did have people come to write with me in my apartment at my agent's suggestion, because I was so isolated, because I was living by myself and caring for my dog. And when Woodrow got really sick, I wouldn't leave him for more than a few hours because I didn't know if I would come home and find him alive or not. And my agent very kindly and very sternly said, Jenna, like, we know Woodrow is like your baby, but we understand you have to stay in the house with him, but also you are a writer. And even if you just write one afternoon a week, I want you to have this bake into your calendar, because when he is gone, you need to remember who you are. So have your people come to you. If you cannot go to them, they will come to you. So I invited friends in, which was a big thing for me. I also write in isolation, and I did not like it. I'm like, I'm letting people into my weird little freak, messy world, my canine nursing home, like my walk around the apartment muttering Virginia Woolf ass, existence. And because my friends are amazing and they're all writers, they got it. They'd sit on either side of me at the dining room table and write with me. And it was my friend Mark who actually gave the memoir the depth that it has, because the first draft was just about Woodrow, and I was walking him through the ideas. And he said to me, like, wait a minute, like, why were you all alone caring for your dog? And I said, well, you know this, like, I'm not married, and I just broke an engagement and I don't have kids. And he was like, that's what needs to be in the memoir. And I'm like, but it about a dog though, you're so wrong. And I realized he was totally right. So having the friends to bounce the ideas off, even verbally, is totally invaluable. I encourage everybody to have a writing community. If it works for you, don't listen, Meredith. And it might be different with every book, just the way grief is different for every person, every situation. The writing of each book feels a little bit different to me as well. But I love my community, and then I'm grateful to have my agent and editor also as the good angels on my shoulder.
Well, I feel like maybe, that's what grieving is letting people in and letting our lives get messy and having them see the mess. And I really felt that in the Guncle where these kids come into his life and like mess things up and make him deal with stuff. And what I appreciated about the Guncle was that it was addressing a type of grief, and it talks about this in the book, that the main character is like, I'm grieving this friend, but I feel like the husband and the kids have more of a right to their grief than I have to mine. So I really appreciated that. So Stephen, did you feel like that is underrepresented in fiction? Or, how do you experience that yourself, I guess?
It might be slightly underrepresented, but it's something I find fascinating. There's certain grief that we can very easily put into context, right? And also sometimes it falls in line with the natural order of things. We expect to lose our parents, or for them to predecease us. That's the way it's going to be. When you lose a child, like in Meredith's story, like that's very out of the natural order of things. And those can be devastating. There is a cultural understanding of that is very, very wrong. Writing about dogs in Lily and the Octopus too, and this is what is so, striking about Jenna's work as well, is that, I grew up with dogs. They were all, and I had a rural home in Maine. We had a barn, and the dogs, often slept in the barn, except on the coldest nights. But in the past couple of decades, we have welcomed dogs and pet, animals into our lives, into our families, and promoted them to full-fledged family member status, but we haven't evolved the conversation on how we grieve them at the same rate at which we have promoted them. So from the outside, people who don't understand these relationships don't really know how to offer comfort. It's a lot of like, oh, are you getting another dog? As if they could be so easily replaceable. One thing I do love about people who love animals is, I do think they have such brave hearts. And I think in general, after grieving, like we grieve, but it doesn't stop us from loving again. With animals, so many of us get to the back of the line and sign up to do it all over again when the time is right. And I think that's so brave. With friends, with losing a friend, and I'm writing about this now in my current novel, because I do think, and especially I turned 50 last year, so I have friends who are 25 years older than me. I have friends who are 25 years younger than me. It's really interesting, and there's no deal. There's no set natural order of when you lose a friend necessarily, and we have different friends for different reasons. We have friends we see once a year for coffee. We have incredible best friends who sometimes are closer than family members. And so when you say you lose a friend, the world doesn't necessarily understand the full context of what that can mean. And it requires further explanation. And so, yes, Patrick is a character in the Guncle who lost this child's mother, was his friend first. He's the one who sort of brought her into the family by introducing him to his brother, which led to her being the sister-in-law. But now here's his brother without a wife. Here's these children without a mother. The attention naturally sort of goes to them, and he feels a little adrift. And wait a minute, I lost something too. And he's a character who's been grieving for 10 years, and another loss, which we learn about over the book. And so I think his grief journey was one of isolating himself and shutting himself off from the world. And suddenly, yes, these kids intrude, like you say, it's suddenly brought into his world. And he, I think, quickly realizes that his grief journey is not the one he wants for these kids. And to for that not to happen, he's got to pivot really quickly and show them a better way.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question of the grief, I love that term, grief journey. So we can get back to my beginning, middle, end thing. Jenna, you're the death of Woodrow. I mean, like the dog dies at the end. I'm not like, spoiler alert.
It's a whole genre.
And yes, I cried, and you all will cry, but it's great. You'll love it. But talk about, but the book is about mourning. So like you're mourning before Woodrow dies. And so I thought that was really interesting too, that we grieve other things, like not just death, right? Can you talk a little about what you were mourning sort of even before Woodrow died? And I'm also curious if writing this was part of your mourning process, like if you could talk a little bit about your grief journey, I guess I'm saying.
Yes, absolutely. What great questions. So I'm thinking about mourning Woodrow before he was gone. I actually started doing that when he was 10. It's in the prologue, and he lived to be 15. And when Woodrow was 10, I found the first white hair on his back. Like I was ferminating him, and I found it, and I was like, oh my God, what even is that? And I had this sort of clang that I remembered from My dad also had passed many years ago, but he passed of a heart attack, and he had a major heart attack and then lived another like 30 years. That every time the phone rang, I thought, oh my God, is it my dad? So I kind of knew, like I knew what a harbinger was. And when I found that white hair on Woodrow's back, I thought, my dog is aging. Oh my gosh, I don't know if I can stand this. You know, like, I loved my parents. I talked to them on the phone. I talked to my dad once a week, my mom once a week. My mom, I saw 3 times, 4 times a year in Florida. We were really good friends. But Woodrow was my everyday, you know, my north, my south, my east, my west, my workday, weekend, Sunday best, as the Auden poem about grief says. And he was really such part of my structure. So when I found that white hair, I called it the secret hair. I like hid it back under his black fur. And just was like, okay, Coops, which is what I called him. I'm like, we'll just pretend that didn't happen. But what did start to happen was that his health eroded because his age clock ticked forward periodically. And those of you who've cared for pets and lost them, you know what I'm talking about. So first it was the hair, and then a year later, his legs gave out for the first time when we were walking, and I had to sit on the sidewalk with him in downtown Boston while he just looked at me like, Mamu, what is wrong with legs? So, and then he couldn't get upstairs to my sleeping loft. So for the first time in his then 13 years, we slept apart. So it was a sort of a long, slow season of letting him go. And in the prologue to Woodrow on the Bench, I described it as knowing that I was going to go over Niagara Falls in a barrel, and that there was going to be this inevitable precipitous drop. And did that make it any easier when the day happened? Not at all. Like, not at all. You know, I was prepared for it, and yet nobody wants to let go of a creature or a being, a spirit they love. And so it was incredibly difficult. And I think the gift that Woodrow gave me before he passed was really helping me build this community, all of these people who coalesced around the lightning rod of my very ancient, very elegant lab as he sat on his bench. And they really lifted me up in the days after his passing. And it really, like, people came and sat Shiva with me, and I didn't even know what Shiva was. Like, I'm a very bad half Jew. My friend Tracy's like, you're half Jewish and you don't know that you're not supposed to leave the house for a week, and we're going to bring you challah and take care of you. Like, don't look in the mirror. Which was also a blessing, not to look in a mirror at that point. But I mean, people did not treat Woodrow like a dog. The Dutch edition of the book is called Not Only a Dog. And I was very blessed with friends who came to me with flowers, with food, who sat with me, who like broke my crackers into little bites because I could eat them, because it's easier for grieving people to eat little bites, and really just stayed with me around the clock and for weeks, until I felt like I was a little more ambulatory and able to face the world again. And writing Woodrow on the Bench is absolutely something I knew I was going to do while he was on the bench. And I thought, I love this dog more than anything. The best way I can honor him is by flexing these writing muscles I've been developing since I was 4 years old, and writing a book about him. And that time on the bench gave me the basket to put the story in, like the basket to put the love in, because it was not only about my love for Woodrow, it was about the love of the people who surrounded us. Even if I had never met some of these people before and would never meet them again, they lifted me up. So that actually makes me a little weepy.
Yeah, we'll give you a moment to recover. And what we've been talking, we've said this in the session already, that there's no right way to grieve, there's no wrong way to grieve. We all do it differently. Meredith, in your book, you talk about you have different characters grieving. Actually, Stephen, so do you. I wonder, as fiction writers, is there a freedom in there being kind of no right or wrong way to grieve, as you're writing different characters and what they're doing? Was there research involved, or did you just feel like, well, I can't really get this wrong? So Meredith, maybe you could start us off.
Yeah, I don't think that we need to do research about grief and sorrow. I think we know everybody experiences loss and grief. I think as I started to write about these parents losing a child, as I said, I didn't make any correlation between that loss and a different kind of loss that I experienced as a 16-year-old. And so I went into it fresh. And I think that there was a sense for me that I needed to learn how these people were going to respond. I understood there's a wonderful Maine expression: if somebody is very pressed very hard with some terrible event in life, they'll say he or she went into herself, she went into herself, or he went into himself. And that was very helpful to me. I came to understand that Doris's response was to go into herself. She was the person who had said from the beginning, we live on an island. This farm is an island and we are safe here. This is our stronghold. And if it is a force from outside that is going to cause harm here, if it's going to come from anywhere, it's going to come from outside. It's not going to come from here. Tup had a different feeling. Tup sensed that there was something in him that was problematic, that there was something inherent in him that was going to cause trouble, that he was somehow going to fail at protecting his family. So they each imagined how this was going to come in very different ways, and they responded very differently. Doris went into herself. We would call it now a profound and prolonged depression, but that language didn't exist at that time. And she was not able to function. She functioned in a very minimal way in the chores that were necessary on the farm. Her daughter Dodie ended up having to step in and take over a tremendous burden of work. She was very young. By the time she was 14, she was the woman of the farm, running the farm. I think that Beston, the youngest child, hardly speaks. He goes silent, right? We hardly hear him speak. And I think that each of these characters experiences this loss in a very different way and has very different tools and very different inadequacies, to bring to this kind of enormous event. So my project, as I wrote, was to tune in and pay close attention and listen to what these people were telling me about how they were going to go about all of this. I was very concerned that I would not be up to describing Doris's experience. I don't experience depression myself. It's something that I know about, but I don't know personally. And I was afraid that I would get that wrong. But I tried to pay just very, very close attention to what would I feel if this were one of my children. Something I wanted to mention is that as I was writing this book, I had friends and family so excited about it coming. When is it going to be ready? I want to read it. And I found myself warning away parents of small children, saying, don't read this now. Don't read this now. You don't need to read this right now. Wait a few years and then come back to this. I found myself feeling very protective of them reading something that I think we personally turn away from. The idea that we might lose a child is so horrendous to us that we quite literally turn away. We can't bear hearing it or considering it. And here I was writing a book about it. So I think, in a way, it asks a great deal of the reader to stay with this story and incorporate a kind of death, a kind of loss that we are just hardwired to resist. And I think that added a grave consideration for me in how I portrayed each of these people going through that experience.
Isn't that the wonderful thing about books, though, is that they will wait for us until we're ready. And Jenna, I know with this and with Woodrow and with Lily and the Octopus, I never know exactly when is the right moment to recommend the book. Sometimes it's helpful, readers are very individual. Sometimes it's helpful when they're going through a loss to help them to process it, or when they're about to face a loss, pre-grieving, as Jenna mentioned. And sometimes readers absolutely cannot, and that's okay too, that the book will sit there and it will wait until the right time. And the books that have the most impact on it is not only the right book, but it's like when we read it in our lives. But I'm also very grateful for everyone who, tuning into this panel too, because people will ask me, am I going to cry? When I read one of your books, I don't know. With my books, I can promise you'll laugh. Whether you cry, that's an individual thing. But is that so terrible? Is that a terrible thing? Like if a piece of art moves you to, such emotion that you have a physical reaction, like I think that's a really good thing, and I think it's a really brave thing, as a reader to to consume and confront and process their own feelings about it too. So.
Yes,
Yeah.
and Stephen, I think one of the things that happens for readers is that they bring their own experiences of joy and grief and identify those experiences with what we're writing. When my memoir came out, I was very surprised to see the responses. People were so forthcoming in telling me their own private stories, that because these were secret stories, people literally lined up in my life saying, I never told anybody this, but my father expelled my brother and has never spoken to him since. And the kinds of losses that got tangled up in the loss that I was describing in that book, where it was very interesting to me, you know, I wrote at length about being shunned, and people would write to me and say, you know, my family has shunned me because of my gender transition. My family has shunned me because I married outside my faith. I think that there are so many ways to experience these feelings of loss that I think we carve out a path and invite people along that path with us. And the markers along that path are theirs. They belong to each reader individually.
I just want to remind everyone that you can throw any questions in the Q&A and we will take those momentarily. And I want to thank you for all the wonderful suggestions. Leslie's done a great job of rounding most of those up. There are a few more that came in after that. But I haven't read all of these. I've read many of them, and they are all in some way about loss. And, you know, Jenna, you're a fiction writer too. You're all fiction writers as well as memoir in some cases. So I wonder what it is, like what does giving a character a loss like this, what does it do for story? Why are they so prevalent in fiction or memoir? Yeah, is it just because we all experience it, or is it more than that?
I'm so moved by, oh, sorry, Jenna, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, if there's anything more universal than grief, I don't know what it is, even though the experience of each person is different, and then the experience of each grief is different, and grief is very wily. So it shapeshifts. So you think, oh, I've got this knocked, and then a different grief comes along and knocks you into a different position. And I think having gone through, you know, the past few years, I had a series of griefs that kind of knocked me back. And I will be candid and be like, right now I'm going through a terrible breakup. So I have heartbreak grief, which is different. And when that came along, I was like, now I'm going to have grief face again. And I need more Botox because I have this grief coming. Like, I know there are certain things that will happen to me, and then certain things that are always new. So I would say, as a novelist and as somebody who wrote a memoir, my goal in all of that is to help a reader feel less alone. To say that here is a character, whether it's me, or a dog, or a person I invented who came into my head, who's going through this experience. If you read this and you feel less alone because you see that echoed in your own life, mirrored, or it resonates a chord in your life, then I have done my job. And I feel as though writing about grief is maybe one of the best services we can do, because it will help people feel less alone in their own grieving. And even if our griefs are all a little different, there's something that is foundational about having to go through the process to take the journey nobody wants to take, and yet we all inevitably have to. And I think, just as you guys can maybe speak to this, I always feel a bit like a sadist when I'm writing fiction. There's that great Graham Greene quote, there's a splinter of ice in the heart of every writer, and I need to give my characters their journeys. And that means that I'm not writing about the happinesses of their lives usually. It would be a very short book if everybody was happy. It'd be like one page and it'd be really boring. So characters are going on a journey. Grief is an incredible journey. It requires great grit to get through. It requires community. It requires grace that you can't conjure, that you just have to maybe be open to. And it is a very strange journey, and a wondrous journey that helps break open your life like an egg or a sunrise. And then all of a sudden you find yourself pointed in a different direction. And maybe even if you didn't want to go in that direction, it's still a gift. So I think as a human being and also as a writer, it's a very strangely useful thing.
Yeah, I'm very moved by something, you know, Meredith pointed out, which is as if loss is not prevalent to the human condition enough already, that we foist so much loss upon each other. We do so much of this to ourselves, casting out people, as she mentioned, and right now, there's so many, it's kind of a dark time right now in this country. There are a lot of people scrambling to grab power by stepping on the backs of some of the most vulnerable amongst us, and it's really ugly. And there's going to have to be writing done to understand this, at the same time when there are so many people trying to ban books and ban stories, to the extent that we heal, and to the extent that minority communities have gained rights, a lot of times it has come from the fact that we have been able to tell our stories. And so now we have to tell these stories now more than ever, I think, because there's such a dark force also trying to ban a lot of stories from a lot and take voices away from a lot of people. And that just causes such irreparable harm. It makes me very sad. It's something else I'm kind of grieving. We're all on top of that. I've got flies. There's we have a new puppy. I talked about like how, so with new puppies, our doors are always open to the backyard, and now there are flies buzzing around me in this house. And now I lost my train of thought, but anyhow.
You were saying something beautiful about empathy and about how we need these stories, especially because they're being banned. And I was reminded of a piece I wrote, and I can't remember the author, shame on me, about how if social media encourages a lack of empathy, which is both true and not true, stories, because they are so immersive and invite the reader to spend time in somebody else's skin and experience, are the best empathy builders there are, because it's
hard to deny someone else their humanity when you have heard their story. And Hope just raised it in the comments here. What I was going to say is, like, we're all grieving after the past 2 years that we've had. We're all grieving, as a world, like, we have not begun to process what we've just been through. There's been so much loss. And even if we haven't lost, or know someone who lost their life, we are grieving the loss of time together, a loss of togetherness. And so it's a really interesting time to write about grief, and why there's going to be so much more writing about grief, because a lot of this is still untapped.
We have a question from Jennifer. She writes that she's writing a memoir which focuses on the deaths of her parents who were diagnosed with cancer in the same year. Sadly, extended family, step-parents, and others they make appearances in the book, and they're not always shown in the best light. And so she's wondering if you all, or any of you, have experienced this situation, and how did you deal with the guilt about writing about people in a negative way, and just the general emotional impacts of that.
That's a really good, I guess I could take, usually the trick is, if you're writing memoir, people think that you're like not writing about them. And if you write fiction, they think that you are writing about them. So there is that. But I had to obviously write about people in the memoir who knew Woodrow. And the person who I was most worried about was my former fiance, who bookends the memoir, who shows up in the beginning and the end. But there's a chapter in the middle when I'm explaining why he was my former fiance. And I had to actually write that, because otherwise, like, why was I sitting all alone on this bench with a dog dependent on friends and strangers? And that did worry me a little bit, obviously, to write about him. He's still alive. Like, I thought I was being smart writing a book about a dog who was dead, because the dog obviously was not going to come back to me and say, you wrote me the wrong way. But giving the book to this person, to Jim, was unnerving. And I tried to portray him as honestly as I could and with as much love as I could. And I gave him the memoir. And I'm sorry to laugh at this, but one of the reasons that we weren't together is he's a National Geographic photographer. And his idea of a relationship was that he would like be a sperm donor, and then he would like drive off in his Airstream and come back every few years and visit the child. And I used that as a sort of an anecdote to explain why we weren't together. And when I gave him that, he said, do you really have to put the conversation about me being the sperm donor in the book? And I was like, would you like me to use X, Y, or Z other anecdotes instead? And he's like, no, sperm donor is fine. So he was very gracious about it. And in fact, when I gave him the memoir to read, he called me and he cried and said, like, because he loved Woodrow so much. And he said, like, this is just a magical thing. And, thank you for writing this. And I give you my blessing, except the sperm donor thing. So we have gone around and around the bush about the sperm donor thing for a long time. Anyway, I had the great privilege of doing an interview with Cheryl Strayed on A Mighty Blaze in the summer of 2020 and asked her about this very issue about writing memoir and how, it's the number one question she gets asked is, how do you write about actual people in your life and not worry about fallout? And she said, you do worry about fallout. And you have to be prepared that if you write about people, there will be consequences. You have to be okay with the consequences and you have to question your motivation. And if you are writing people out of love and you're writing them as you see them, and you're not doing it out of revenge and you're not doing it out of spite, if you can sleep at night knowing those things, then you will probably be okay. But that was her advice, is know why you're doing it and then do it as respectfully as possible and know this is your own story. And those people can also tell their own stories in which you might be a villain or a snow queen or a princess or whatever. Everybody has the right to his or her own story.
I'd like to add something to that too. I think that's very smart. I think that it's very important that a writer understands that at the moment we're committing words to a page that we imagine ever going to a publisher, we are accepting that we have moved beyond the thinking, we've moved beyond the coming to terms, we've moved beyond the mess of emotional response. We are at our craft. And when we're at our craft, we are able to control the story so that we are fair. That fairness can only happen if we are controlling the story. So I think it's really important for writers when they're in that terrible moment that every memoirist finds herself or himself in, of how do I do this and do this fairly? I think the question is, am I ready to step back and take charge of this as a craftsperson? And if I am, I think I'll be okay.
Well, we're running out of time. So I want to point out that I think you can copy and paste. Leslie's going to post the final list of suggestions. So I guess my final question to you all is if you have any other title suggestions. Were there books that you used for inspiration as you were writing your books? Or is there something you turn to when you're feeling like you need some, I don't know, help to get through your day?
I would say the queen was Joan Didion's Year of Magical Thinking.
Yes.
For me, that is an extraordinary book. It's a lot of people I'm sure have read it. When I wrote Lily and the Octopus, I started trying to find an agent by pitching it as a cross between Joan Didion's Year of Magical Thinking and Moby Dick, which, by the way, did not get me an agent. So don't ever do that. But what a remarkable book.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Yes,
Any other? Yeah.
Yes, I'll step in with that. I'm a great admirer of Faulkner, and he gave me permission to do a couple things. One is that kind of episodic storytelling, which he excels at, excuse me. And he also is a writer who understands the great tenderness of that dark part of our lives. It's a very, very tender place. And I think that Faulkner, more than most writers, understands and conveys the tenderness of that darkness in our lives. I also happened to read, as I was starting to write, a book by an absolutely wonderful Norwegian writer, Tarjei Vesaas, called The Birds. And it is an astonishing story filled with ongoing loss and yet filled with light and joy, that beneficence that plays so significantly in my novel. I believe that we all hunger for and seek beneficence, and I believe that we each carry it in us. It's a state that we long for because we know it. It is ours. And this guy Vesaas is all over it in this stunning little book called The Birds. It's one of the most beautiful books I've read. And it had great effect on me to recognize, to feel this man knows beneficence. This writer understands beneficence, and it is the foundation of this book.
I think that's probably a great place to end. I love that idea that we all have this in us. And I want to thank you all for talking about what can be a really difficult subject with such grace yourselves and intelligence, and I appreciate it.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. And I have been monitoring the chat the whole time, and I'm sure everyone else has. And I know a lot of you are grieving now and have a lot going on in your personal lives. So peace be with you all, and our love to anyone who is in that position. We thank you so much for being here for this joyful conversation on grief. We're so thankful you could all be here. Jenna, Meredith, Stephen, Hannah, thank you again. And I hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.